Hey, it's TDA and welcome back to Satisfactory. Today I want to show you how to build a large modular factory very easily with the use of blueprints. Check back the previous video for guidelines about how to make your own blueprints easily. I will be using them all of them in this episode, so you can just take that. But I do recommend not just copying my own blueprints, but kind of thinking about what you want to build and then making your own. It's also worth noting that I'm picking this area to build my modular factory because it's going to be quite huge. There is a large amount of high quality nodes around here and a decent amount of open space, as you can see. So I'm using this space, but you can do this pretty much anywhere on the map, of course, depending a little bit on the size of the factory that you're going to build. Before you start building, I highly recommend that you bring yourself literal truckloads of building materials because you're going to go through them really fast by the use of blueprints. And I do mean use trucks rather than tractors like I've done over here, because of course trucks will fit a lot more. If you happen to have a lot of resources close by, then you probably don't need to do this, but in my case I am building quite far away from my hubs and running up and down is really tedious and annoying, so just try to bring yourself inventories full of stuff. If you go back halfway through your build, I would recommend that you place down something like an industrial storage or something like that. Dump your entire inventory in there, so you basically go back completely empty, fill up both your own inventory as well as that of a truck or some other vehicle, and then travel back, because you're going to need all the resources you can get. Now, before you start building, I recommend you kind of think about what you're going to be doing, and that might make a lot of sense, but still. In my case, I want a facility that's going to be producing modular engines and adaptive control units, and I kind of planned my way backwards in terms of how much resources I'm going to need. Now, you don't actually have to plan ahead if you don't want to. You can just start building with the end product that you have in mind and kind of figure out what you're going to need in terms to actually build that, then build those things, and then kind of work your way backwards like that. Now, the alternative, and that's actually the way I'm going to be doing it in this episode, is I kind of already have a feel for what I'm approximately going to need. I'm actually going to be building from the base products first, so with the basic ingots and plates and stuff like that, and then kind of that allows me to better plan how my factory is going to flow, what resources are going to go where. And it will also allow me to kind of just overshoot these targets. I'm going to have a bit of extra production going on along with some buffer blocks that I showed you in the previous episode, so that my factory will double up as both a production facility as well as kind of a hub where I can pick up all those resources. In order to build efficiently with blueprints, I recommend building a scaffold like this. This is just meant for easy access to our facility and to avoid too many camera issues while trying to expand it. It's not going to be part of the actual facility, but it does serve as a guideline about where it's going to be, what the center is going to be, and make sure everything is aligned to the world grid, because for some reason the blueprints themselves don't actually snap to the world grid, but if you make sure the first one does, then you can snap every other blueprint to it and you should not have any issues with that. So you can see it's also erased from the floor slightly. That's mainly because the terrain here is not entirely flat, and I want to make sure I don't run into clipping issues too quickly. I do try to keep my factories more or less aligned with the ground floor, so I don't want the sky factories or anything like that, but of course that is something you can do if that doesn't bother you. Don't worry about the trees and the other things like cactuses and things like that too much. You can always remove them after you're done, because basically we're going to have our factory initially floating a little bit in the air until we're mostly done, and then make sure it doesn't look like some sort of floating fortress. Keep in mind also well that you should have an idea about where your resources are going to come from and where your supply line is going to be. So in my case, for example, I know there's a couple of nodes over here that I do want to actually use. So you can see I left myself plenty of space in between so that I can both access these nodes and still have either trucks or trains or whatever we're going to use to make sure the resource actually gets to our factory and we don't run into issues with that. Now, I actually like getting all my resources in my factory from the same side. That's a personal preference, you don't have to do that, but just make sure that you keep in mind where things are going to be coming from. Now, to give you an idea about the process, I've built my two basic building blocks for iron over here. So this is just the normal smelters with the input coming from the other side. And I know that if I interconnect my blocks, I can get 4 of these blocks in a row using Mark for belts. Now, in order to expand this just means that thanks to my scaffolding, this is going to be really simple. Make sure that you aim your building blocks in the correct direction. I do recommend saving before you build any blueprints, because if you make a mistake, it's really annoying to have to redo everything. But once you do, all you need to do is just set this up. And now I have a total of 8 of these smelting blocks all ready to go. And as you can see, just doing this is already a massive facility with, I think, a total of 64 smelters making iron ingots, and this is only going to be the start. Here I've added in another row of smelters for copper, and I basically trying to figure out where to go next. In this case, I've decided to go for steel next, and I also decided that I'm going to be using a specific recipe for that. Let me see, steel ingots. I'm using the ultimate recipe using the iron ingots. So that means I'm going to need even more iron ingot production in order to get everything going. I'm also going to need raw coal, since I'm intending to bring everything in from the same side. I know the coal is going to be coming from this end. I already have a nice row of iron production over here, so I'm probably going to add in another row, and then I think I'm gonna go and kind of flip back my ingots and make sure they can easily combine with the coal I get from this side, and then have my steel production somewhere over here. And it's really important to kind of figure out what you're going to set this up, and kind of set it up in such a way that it makes sense in terms of a logistical order. Also, because you are, if you're going to follow my example, you're going to be using this as a hub, so you kind of want to make it easy for yourself to remember in which area of your factory which items are going to be made. Once you figured out which items are going to go where and which order, I recommend using corridors in order to make your modular factory a lot easier to get around, but also to make sure that you leave yourself enough room to make sure the belts can interconnect. You can actually transport your items through your facility, things like that. Now, making corridors is extremely simple, once again, by using blueprints. Of course, all you need to do is have a very simple blueprint, basically a floor for each level, and then just interconnect those. And by connecting these, that of course becomes extremely easy to build and expand. So as you can see, I can make this corridor very easily. So it will let me connect. There we go. Some more. Not entirely sure why I'm getting the hostile reading, considering nothing should be hostile to me. And this will allow us to bring around the iron ingots that I was talking about just a moment ago from this line of production back here, and then have the coal come in from the other side. And then what we can do is basically use the foundry building blocks on the side over here, kind of shift it a little bit compared to how we've built our smelter so far, aiming them inwards, so we have the output on the right hand side and the inputs from the left hand side if you are facing this way. Now, I currently don't have the resources. Like I said, you're going to be burning through your resources really fast, so I'm gonna go pick something more up and then continue building. Given the amount of buildings you're going to be placing down in a very short time, and the likely diverse amount of products you're going to be producing in them, I highly recommend color coding your buildings in order to keep track of what is actually being produced where. This is something that is typically a very good idea to do in larger bases. If you're going for a more modular type of build, this is not as much needed. But on top of being very useful to make sure you know what's going on where, it always kind of looks cool as well, if you ask me. So it's very easy to see where I'm producing what in this particular build, even if you haven't actually checked any of the recipes in the building. Something I saw a lot when the blueprints were first introduced is people saying, oh, well, now every factory will look the same, it's kind of boring. And to some extent you're right, but don't forget that even though we kind of have this flat factory over here, there's nothing stopping you from going vertical with blueprints either. And in fact, I think it's even easier to go vertical and make your buildings look more interesting by using blueprints, because as it turns out, blueprints actually stack. So it's very easy to just build a second layer on top of here, and then build a third layer and a fourth layer. And of course, you don't necessarily need to stick to a block pattern or anything like that. You can kind of make it in more pyramid shape or a more a less symmetric type of shape, whatever you feel looks best. But again, it's really just about getting all those buildings down. I mean, just look at the amount of smelters I have over here. Regardless of how you construct your facility, you're going to need tons of them, so you might as well be efficient about it. And speaking about being efficient, there's a few more tips that I think you should keep in mind when building a modular factory blueprints. First of all, don't add decoration to your blueprints up front, or at least not too much. And I said this when designing the blueprints as well, but I think it becomes really clear if you look at me being halfway through my second level over here. We're going to have a corridor over here, we're going to have a corridor down there as well. We have this corridor over here. And as you see, if I would have added in a lot of details to the blueprints, like I see a lot of people doing with like pillars in between the smelters and things like that, it looks really nice. And of course, there's nothing stopping you from doing that. But if you do that, it's going to be very hard to move around on this level if you are not going exactly down the pathway. But if you want to go from this side to this side, you would actually have a lot of trouble getting through all of that decoration. On top of that, because you might be changing the direction of your blueprints on the different levels, as you can see I'm doing here, we have this wall over here, we have this wall. I didn't add any walls or anything like that in the blueprints so far on top of what just is in the blueprint. You might end up having to remove a lot of the decoration, or vice versa. If you don't add too much in, you will actually need to add it. But it's a lot easier to think like, oh, okay, I just need to like extend this wall, so let's do that like this, and let's do that like that. Then finding out that if you place a wall over here, you're actually going to be conflicting that with your belt. So add in the decoration at the end. So build your factory first and then add in the decoration. Speaking of actually building this facility, I don't recommend doing this all at once. You can, of course, if you want, but I think you will find that as soon as you power it on, you will find yourself very, very low on power. Probably everything shuts down, and if you're playing like me and when you have one connected world grid, your entire factory and the entire world will shut down. So take it easy, connect a few passageways at a time, make sure you have enough power, maybe add an evening in between where you extend your power resources and things like that. You're also going to need things like plastic and rubber, which produce fuel as a byproduct, so you can add some more power in through that as well. And on top of that, you're going to need a lot of raw resources to actually go in here. So you might as well just get some initial limestone, copper, and iron in the first couple of smelters. And by doing so, you actually make your own life easier when you're building the rest of this factory, because you will have things like concrete, iron plates, and iron rods, etc. on hand while you're actually building this. You don't need everything on hand. You can get some of the more complex resources from your other hubs and things like that you might have built before. But it's very easy to kind of make sure your initial part of your factory is working, so you have some base resource. You don't need to go back for everything whenever you run out of something. And as I think this proves, is that your factory doesn't have to look boring at all, even if you're building with blueprints. Whether or not your factory looks awesome really depends on the outside of the factory, mostly. And that's just a matter of making it look good with things like pillars, windows, alternating things on the walls, nice railings, etc, etc, etc. Of course, it completely depends on your own preference what it actually is that makes it look good, whether or not you care about it looking good as well, of course. But it has nothing to do with the inside of the factory. And honestly, when you're in the inside of the factory, having neatly organized rows of machines is not the worst thing to look at either. So yeah, I think it's a very feasible way and a very optimized way of building factories in this game, specifically on how long it takes to do it manually. And I hope I was able to give you some pointers on how exactly to approach that and what to do and what not to do. So I hope you enjoyed this one. Please like and subscribe if you haven't done so yet, and I will catch you in the next one.